Hi, so I'm going to be talking about, just recognizing where economics and economy has been discussed, well, not only in my life but also, just in education in general. So before I kind of got into thinking about how this affected me, I was trying to think about times in my life where I even learned about economics. And really, only thing I could think about was when I got to high school and it was my senior year and I had an economy class. And that class was genuinely just to teach you about things like, bonds and things like that. Like it wasn't, oh, it was exactly what an economy class would look like. But in terms of, my early years talking elementary school, I think I can only really remember learning about, what is a producer? What is a consumer? Checks, maybe balances. I don't even know if that really came until maybe middle school. Thinking back to that. So, if we're addressing the question of, you know, why isn't this more prevalent in the earlier years? I think it might have a lot to do with the fact that, it is more difficult information. I looked up the definition of it, and according to the American Economic Association, economics is defined as, the study of scarcity, how people use resources and respond to incentives, finances, wealth, and decision making. Of course, you have the micro and macro economics, micro being individual decisions and macro being the economy as a whole. And I think that, I didn't even learn that that was the meaning or remembered that that was the meaning until I got to high school learning about that. So, in terms of why it's not used early enough, I'm thinking maybe because, if we're talking about finances and things like that, kids aren't necessarily thinking about that this early, which is why it doesn't really come up until those high school years. But what appreciated about this website is it said why you should know it. It talked about how it helps you understand news, make financial decisions, and shape public policy. So when we're talking about why it should be introduced to students at an earlier age, I would think that students at an early age, yeah, maybe they're not thinking about finances, but they are people who are becoming a part of the community, people who are a part of civilization. So learning about, public policy is important for them to learn how to engage with reducing and reusing and recycling and all of those things, how they are learning, okay, what is going wrong in the world and how can I help at an early age? So, the second question of how do we explore diverse strategies to ensure that students are introduced at an early age? I actually read this article that's called It's Never Too Early, Why Economic Education in the Elementary Classroom, and that was by Bonnie T. Mazzaros and Stella Evans. And they were talking about how it's important to think about that, kids at an early age, they're more focused on, I can have it all. So part of economics is teaching them that you cannot have it all. We always say the world is not fair. So how can we teach that to them? Well, you can think about, how to make choices, teaching them how to make choices, considering scarcity. They see scarcity as, well, I have an adult that's telling me I can't do something, and, they're placing those constraints on me. But scarcity also involves other things. So figuring out how can we make it so that students are learning that things are not always fair. So one example that that article gave was trade-offs, teaching them about trade-offs. You give up something to get more of something else. My mom used to always tell me, well, if you throw away some of your clothes that are old and you can't fit them anymore, then you'll get more new clothes that you can fit and that are fresh. So just thinking about those things and then, investigating some interdisciplinary activities might include finding things like if we're talking about math, maybe we're including money talk, maybe we're including savings, and maybe we're talking about spending and interest, things like that. So those are just a few things that you can include in those early years to make sure that students are starting to get that grasp of it and find it interesting because we don't want them to get to high school and it seems like something that's so scary. And it talked about how economics is like a spiral. It can start off with simple things and build your way up to the more harder things along the way. So I think those are some great ideas that came out of those two articles, just figuring out ways to be inclusive with that learning and make it interesting. So yeah, that's what I've got. Thanks for listening.